At 75, Eleanor had learned to read the world with a quiet patience. She had witnessed decades of change, wars, celebrations, heartbreaks, and miracles. And through it all, she had carried herself with dignity and strength. Her life had been full of sacrifices, mostly for her family. She had raised children with love, poured her time and energy into them, often putting her own desires aside. And now, as the matriarch of her family, she had thought she would be included, valued, and respected. But today, that illusion shattered in a single sentence. "You're too old to travel with us, Grandma. Just watch the house." Her daughter-in-law's voice had been sharp, clinical even, like she was delivering a verdict rather than expressing a thought. Her son had only nodded in agreement, avoiding her eyes. The words cut deeper than any sharp object ever could. Eleanor forced a smile, nodding politely, though her stomach twisted and churned with an emotion she hadn't felt in years: betrayal. She excused herself, retreating to the kitchen, where the familiar scent of freshly brewed tea usually brought comfort. Today, even the aroma felt foreign, almost mocking. She poured herself a cup, her hands trembling slightly, not with age, but with a storm of suppressed hurt. The children she had nurtured, the family she had devoted her life to, had deemed her too old, too cumbersome, too irrelevant to share in their joy. Sitting at the table, she stared out the window at her garden. The roses she had tended for decades swayed gently in the breeze, as if mocking her helplessness. She remembered a time when she had traveled, exploring cities far and wide, walking streets she had only dreamed of as a girl. She had felt alive then, vibrant, unrestrained. Now they wanted to confine her to a single room, a single house, as though life had no meaning past a certain age. The betrayal was compounded by quiet memories. Birthdays she had celebrated alone, invitations she had declined to prioritize others, mornings spent cooking breakfast while the house slept. She had given everything, and yet, her family saw her as a relic, an object to be left behind, overlooked, ignored. Eleanor's eyes welled with tears, but she did not allow them to fall. She had always believed in facing life with courage, even when the world seemed unkind. By evening, the anger began to mix with resolve. She realized something fundamental. They could not decide the limits of her life. Her spirit was not confined by age, nor would it ever be. 75 years had taught her that dignity and joy were hers to claim, regardless of anyone's permission. She thought of her own mother, who had traveled until her 70s, refusing to bow to anyone's doubts or fears. That same fire, Eleanor realized, still burned within her. She moved around the house, tidying absent-mindedly, though her mind was elsewhere. The children were upstairs, packing for the trip she was not allowed to join. Their laughter drifted down the hallway, a cruel reminder of what they had assumed she would not notice. Eleanor smiled faintly, a plan beginning to take shape. If they thought she would sit quietly, they were sorely mistaken. She would find a way to show them, not with confrontation or anger, but with action. As night fell, the house grew quiet. Eleanor poured herself a second cup of tea, sat in her favorite armchair, and stared into the flickering shadows of the fireplace. She thought of the life she still had to live, the experiences yet to be claimed. And in that silence, a quiet determination took root. They might have said she was too old, too fragile, too irrelevant. But Eleanor knew better. Life had taught her resilience, courage, and patience. And soon, they would learn, in the most unforgettable way, that 75 years of living could never be dismissed. The night closed in, and Eleanor went to bed with a mind awake and restless, a heart quietly alight with rebellion. Tomorrow would come, and with it, a chance to reclaim what they had denied her. Her freedom, her adventure, and her spirit. The morning sunlight poured gently through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns across the wooden floor. Eleanor awoke with a lingering ache in her joints, as she often did at 75, but there was also a strange flutter in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and quiet defiance. She moved slowly to the kitchen, stretching her arms and savoring the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. That's when she noticed it. A small envelope lying near the coffee maker. It wasn't unusual for her children to leave notes, reminders, or lists, but something about this envelope made her pause. Curiosity tugged at her. She picked it up and, with deliberate care, slid it open. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Inside were their tickets. The tickets to the very trip she had been excluded from. 3 adults, 3 children. A week-long journey across cities she had once dreamed of exploring. They had left them behind, perhaps thinking she wouldn't notice, or perhaps confident she would never take them. Eleanor held the tickets in her hands, feeling a rush of emotions, hurt, anger, and something else entirely, exhilaration. The betrayal stung, yes, but it was now paired with opportunity. They had underestimated her, dismissed her, and in doing so, they had handed her the perfect chance to prove herself. She didn't need anyone's permission. If they thought she would sit quietly, they were wrong. For a long moment, she simply sat at the kitchen table, studying the tickets as if they were treasure maps leading to her freedom. Memories of past adventures danced in her mind. The bustling markets she had wandered, the quiet museums where she had lost herself in art, the cafes where strangers had become companions over shared laughter and stories. She could still feel the thrill of stepping into unknown cities, the sense of wonder that made her pulse race. Eleanor made a decision. She would not simply watch life pass by from the comfort of her house. She would reclaim it. The realization filled her with a thrill she hadn't felt in decades. She would go, not as a passive observer, but as the heroine of her own story. The preparations were simple, yet deliberate. She packed a small suitcase, careful to include essentials: comfortable clothes, a sturdy pair of shoes, her favorite scarf, and a notebook where she could record every detail of her adventure. She smiled as she slipped in a few photographs of herself from years past, reminders of the woman she had been and the woman she still was. She wasn't just going on a trip, she was reclaiming herself. Her hands trembled slightly, not with age but with excitement. Every movement felt electrified with the power of agency. She imagined her children upstairs, busy packing for a journey she was now part of in spirit, and the thought brought a sly, quiet joy. They had assumed she would wait, that she would stay behind, silent and obedient. They had misjudged her entirely. Eleanor allowed herself a moment of reflection. 75 years had not dulled her sense of wonder. They had not diminished her capacity to experience life fully, and they had certainly not extinguished her determination to live on her own terms. The tickets in her hand were more than paper. They were a symbol of defiance, a key to a freedom they had never intended to grant her. By late morning she was ready. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the home she had loved and cared for, but which now felt like a temporary prison. Her pulse quickened at the thought of stepping into the unknown, of venturing into cities and streets her family had assumed she could never navigate. She felt alive, sharp, and unexpectedly youthful, as if the years that weighed upon her body could not touch the spirit that surged within. With a final glance around the house, Eleanor whispered to herself, "Let's show them what 75 years can do." And with that, she stepped out the door, suitcase in hand, her heart brimming with anticipation. Today marked the beginning of her reclamation, not just of a trip, but of the freedom, joy, and respect she had always deserved. The taxi ride to the airport felt surreal. Eleanor sat upright, her hands clasped tightly over her small suitcase, feeling a pulse of excitement that she hadn't felt in decades. The city streets blurred past her window, familiar yet distant, as if she were leaving not just the house but a lifetime of being underestimated behind. She watched people rush past, oblivious to the quiet revolution unfolding in the mind of the 75-year-old woman among them. As she stepped out of the taxi and into the terminal, a shiver of exhilaration ran down her spine. Airports had always held a certain magic for her. The hum of voices in multiple languages, the scent of coffee mixed with jet fuel, the constant movement of people on journeys of all kinds. Today it was her own journey, one she had carved out without anyone's blessing, and that realization made her chest swell with pride. The check-in line was busy, but Eleanor moved with purpose, her posture upright, her eyes bright and alert. Some passengers glanced at her curiously, perhaps noticing the woman who moved with quiet authority despite her age. She smiled politely, secretly savoring the thought that she was defying every stereotype of the old woman, who stayed home, sedentary and silent. When the airline clerk handed her boarding pass, Eleanor felt a thrill ripple through her. It was more than a piece of paper. It was a passport to freedom, an emblem of defiance against a family that had dismissed her. She adjusted her scarf, straightened her bag, and made her way to the gate, her steps steady, each one a small victory. Boarding the plane, Eleanor felt the hum of possibility settle in her chest. She chose her seat by the window, placing her suitcase snugly in the overhead compartment. As the plane taxied down the runway, she gazed out at the tarmac, at the airplanes lined up like soldiers ready for adventure. The engines roared to life, lifting her skyward, and with it, a surge of liberation filled her soul. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the vibration of the plane beneath her feet echo in her bones. This was her moment. They had told her she was too old to travel, too fragile to explore, too irrelevant to join. Yet here she was, soaring above their assumptions, above the limits they had tried to impose. The clouds outside seemed to part just for her, bright and infinite, a reminder that life did not belong to anyone but herself. Eleanor spent the flight imagining the cities she would wander, the streets she would explore, the cafes she would sit in, and the museums where she would lose herself in art. She pictured herself talking to strangers, laughing easily, absorbing the energy of people she had never met, but whose lives would intersect with hers in fleeting, beautiful ways. Each vision made her pulse quicken with youthful energy, as if the 75 years of her life had compressed into a heartbeat of freedom. She also thought of her family, the ones who had left her behind. She pictured the moment they would realize she was not just going along quietly, but had taken control of the adventure they had assumed was theirs alone. She imagined the shock, the confusion, perhaps even the shame, and a quiet smile tugged at her lips. This wasn't malice. This was poetry in action. They had dismissed her, and she was claiming her place in the world, gracefully, triumphantly. As the plane climbed higher, Eleanor felt a sense of rebirth. Each mile carried her further from confinement and closer to life lived on her terms. She opened her notebook and began jotting down ideas, sketches of landmarks, restaurants to try, memories to record, experiences to savor. The journey had just begun, but she felt as though she had already won. By the time the plane leveled off above the clouds, Eleanor leaned back in her seat and let herself smile fully, deeply. She was 75 years old, alone, and yet utterly unstoppable. The world below stretched wide and inviting, a canvas ready for her to paint with joy, curiosity, and defiance. And when she returned, they would see the proof. Age could never cage a spirit as fierce as hers. The week passed in a blur of discovery, laughter, and exhilaration. Eleanor wandered through bustling city streets, her senses alive to every sound, every smell, every fleeting interaction. She marveled at the architecture, lingered in art galleries, and sampled foods she had only ever dreamed of trying. Each day was an affirmation of her independence, a quiet defiance of the assumptions that had once tried to confine her. She made friends with strangers who reminded her of the joy of spontaneity, people unburdened by expectation, who laughed easily and welcomed her stories. In cafes tucked away down cobblestone streets, she scribbled in her notebook, recording observations and memories, capturing moments that were hers alone. Eleanor felt alive in a way she hadn't in decades, and every heartbeat carried a delicious sense of triumph. Though she had set out to reclaim her freedom, she also relished the thought of her family's reaction. She imagined the shock when they discovered she had not just survived alone in a foreign city, but had thrived, embraced adventure, and returned with stories that proved their assumptions wrong. The thought brought a small, satisfied smile to her lips. This was her revenge, not with malice or confrontation, but through undeniable proof of her vitality, her courage, and her spirit. When she finally returned home, the familiar sights of her neighborhood felt different. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had lived fully, unshackled by the limitations others had imposed. She walked through the front door, suitcase in hand, and immediately felt the weight of anticipation pressing in. The moment when her family would see what she had accomplished. They were waiting in the living room, expressions ranging from confusion to panic. Her daughter-in-law's mouth opened, then closed. Her son's eyes widened. Even the grandchildren, sensing tension, clung a little closer to their parents. Eleanor placed her suitcase down and smiled warmly. "Hello," she said, her voice calm, confident, and filled with the satisfaction of victory. No words were needed to convey the message. Her posture, her radiant energy, the the spark in her eyes. Everything spoke louder than any argument could. She had traveled alone, navigated a foreign land, and returned not diminished, but emboldened. She had proven, without saying a single accusatory word, that age could not define her, nor could anyone else. Over the next few days, Eleanor shared her adventures in vivid detail. She displayed photographs of herself at landmarks, laughing with strangers, sampling exotic foods, writing in her notebook in sunlit cafes. Each story carried the subtle but undeniable message. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and yet she had flourished. Her family began to realize, slowly and reluctantly, that their judgment had been flawed. The guilt in their eyes was palpable, though Eleanor did not dwell on it. Her revenge was sweet because it required no confrontation, no anger, only the undeniable proof of her independence and vitality. They had tried to confine her, and she had soared anyway. Eleanor's heart swelled with a profound sense of accomplishment. She had reclaimed not just a trip, but a piece of herself that had been waiting to break free. She had shown, in the most elegant way, that life was hers to live on her terms at any age. The laughter, the memories, the exhilaration, they were hers alone, a testament to 75 years of resilience and courage. As she settled back into her home, Eleanor reflected on the week's journey. She had ventured into the unknown, embraced her independence, and returned with the knowledge that she was unstoppable. The quiet satisfaction of sweet revenge filled her, not with bitterness, but with the joy of triumph, the pride of proving herself, and the unshakable certainty that her spirit would never be confined again. And as she looked out the window at the world beyond, Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. Age had never defined her. Life had never defined her. She was 75, unstoppable, and free, and nothing would ever hold her back again.